Okay, wonderful. So one of the assumptions of the last video, right, was that labor markets are perfectly competitive. I want to take a minute just to talk about what we're assuming when we assume that, right? Essentially what we're saying is that for a particular firm, right, when the market wage is, say, $9 an hour, we're saying that that firm could hire as many workers as they want at a wage of $9 an hour, not a single worker at a wage of $8.95 an hour, right? One of the hallmarks, when we talked about competitive markets in the past, one of the ways that we said we can tell if you're in a competitive market is that you care so little who you're buying from that you don't even remember, right? In other words, when you go to buy a potato, right, you go potato shopping, you don't even think about which farm your potato comes from. You buy from different farms every day, completely indifferent, right? If one particular potato farm decided that they weren't going to sell to you anymore, wouldn't change your life at all. So if we think about this assumption in labor markets, this should mean that if you're a worker, right, you shouldn't care at all who you're working for, right? One employer should be exactly the same as any other employer. If your employer gave you a 10-cent an hour pay cut, you would just walk out and go to another place immediately, right? If you got laid off or fired, you'd be whistling a happy tune on your way out, go off to an identical job. Now, this is not what most people's experience of the labor market is like, right? That is not the way work works for most people. In fact, I think I've seen some survey evidence that losing your job is one of the 4 or 5 highest stress experiences in a person's life, right? Up there with divorce and the death of a loved one. So this is not a very good model for the labor market for most people at all, right? What we might expect is that for many employers, you could hire some people at a wage of $9 an hour, right? Other people would be willing to work for less for you, and other people would be only willing to work for you if you offered even more money, right? In other words, instead of seeing a downward sloping supply of labor to the firm, we might expect a firm to have an upward sloping labor supply. I'm going to call little ls to make it clear that it's supplied to a specific firm. Now, why is your labor supply curve upward sloping as a firm? Because there's some people who already work for you, right, who don't want to quit. There's some people who live really close to your business. There's some people who really like the product that you're making, right, or have friends at the office. There's other people who live far away, who think that you smell bad, right, who think that your decor is ugly, and who are going to need more money to work for you. And we call this situation where a firm has an upward sloping supply of labor, right? We're going to call this a monopsony situation. It's essentially a play on the term monopoly, right? A monopsony is going to be a situation where there's a single buyer who has market power over sellers, right? In other words, there's a consumer of labor who's able to set the price at which they consume labor. Okay, so how is this going to affect a firm's decision, right? How are firms going to behave differently when they have some power over the wage that they pay? Well, as we remember, right, when we talked about competitive firms, we said that firms are going to have a marginal revenue product, right, which is going to be the marginal product of labor times the price of the output. And they would hire workers up until the marginal revenue product equaled the wage. Is that going to be true here? Is this going to be my optimal number of workers to hire? Well, let's think about this the same way we thought about the problem monopolists faced. Right? If I hire this very last worker here, the worker where the value of the revenue they're producing is equal to the wage I'm paying them, that person doesn't earn me any money, right? I break even on that employee. But in order to hire that employee, right, in order to hire this person I'm breaking even on, I had to give all of my other employees a raise, right? I had to increase the wages that I was paying to attract that person to work for me. So just like how a monopolist is going to sell less output than where price equals marginal cost, so that they can jack up the price on all their existing consumers, a monopsonist is going to offer a wage too low, right, lower than the market price, and hire fewer people than they would otherwise, right, fewer people than where wage equals marginal revenue product, in order to hold down the wages of their workers, right? In other words, we're going to end up with an optimal number of workers below where wage equals marginal revenue product. How can we think about this explicitly? Well, again, in a very analogous way to the way we thought about market power on the other side of the market, right? Market power of producers. So in this case, we'll say revenue from each worker is our marginal revenue product. But what's the total cost to us of hiring an extra worker, including the fact that hiring that worker requires us to pay everyone else more? We can call this the marginal expense of labor. Right? And this is going to be the change in my total wage bill that comes about from hiring an extra person. Right? So the derivative of W times L with respect to L. And just like when we talked about marginal revenue, right, we can decompose this into two pieces. So we can say this is going to be W times the derivative of L, which is just going to be WL, plus dW dL times L, right? In other words, the cost to us, the full cost to us of hiring an extra worker is going to be the wage we pay that worker, plus the fact that we had to jack up the wages on all of our other workers to hire them, right? So above our labor supply curve, we're going to have a marginal expense of labor curve. And we're going to hire workers up until the revenue we get, right, the additional revenue we get from another worker, is equal to the cost to us of hiring that worker, including the cost of having to give everyone else a raise. Right? So this is going to be our L star. This is going to be our W star. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is going to be our W star, right? Why is this our W star and not that, as I just foolishly said? Because once we're hiring L star workers, we're going to pay as little as we possibly can in order to attract that many workers to our firm. And is the consequence of this going to be an economically efficient number of workers? Absolutely not. Right? The last worker we're going to hire is going to produce more value for consumers. Right? The stuff they're going to produce is worth more in dollars than their leisure time is worth. We're going to have this whole triangle of deadweight loss here that represents inefficiently low hours of work. Right? Hours that the worker would be values less as leisure time than consumers value in terms of the products it produces. So to see how this plays out, let's imagine that we had the same marginal revenue product and the same labor supply as we did in our competitive example, except now we only have a single employee, right? So before we said that our labor demand in terms of W was going to be 270 minus 20W, right? Which means that our W in terms of L is going to be 270 minus L over 20, right? Which is going to be our MRP. Right? And we said that our labor supply was just equal to 10W. So this means that our marginal expense of labor right, is going to be, oh, and sorry, so this is going to be W of L is going to be 1/10 times L. Right, so this means that our marginal expense of labor is going to be W of L plus dW dL times L. Right, so this is going to be 1/10 L plus 1/10, right, derivative of 1/10 L with respect to L times L is going to be 1/5 L. So if we set my marginal revenue product equal to our marginal expense of labor, we'll say that 270 over 20 minus L over 20 is going to equal L over 5. Right? L over 5 is 4L over 20. So this is going to mean 270 over 20 is going to equal 5L over 20. Right? So L is going to equal 4 times 270 over 20. So L is going to be 2 times 27, which is going to be 54. Right? So instead of hiring 90 workers, like we did before, a single firm is only going to hire 54 workers. And the wage they're going to have to pay them, right, is WL is 1/10 L. So instead of paying them a wage of $9 an hour, they're only going to pay them $5.40 an hour. Right? So we're going to end up with lower levels of employment, inefficiently low levels of employment, and lower wages as a consequence of the fact that firms have market power. So in this environment, right, when we have employers setting a wage inefficiently low, right, at $5.40, and employing an inefficiently low number of people, what would happen if we imposed a minimum wage? Well, let's imagine instead of imposing a minimum wage all the way up to $12 an hour, let's say that we imposed a more modest minimum wage. Like, let's say $9 an hour. So if we thought about labor supply, and of course we know that we'll have 90 labor hours supplied at a wage of $9 an hour. But how many hours will the employer be willing to hire people for? Well, remember, right, the reason that the employer stopped hiring at 54 people is not because they were unwilling to hire more than 54 people at a wage of $5.40. In fact, right, they were willing to hire a lot more than 54 people at a wage of $5.40, right? More than 90 people. The only reason they didn't hire more people is because they weren't willing to raise the wage. So now that the wage has been raised for them, right, they're going to be willing to hire anyone who's willing to work for them at a wage of $9 an hour and who produces more than $9 an hour worth of stuff, right, whose marginal revenue product is more than $9. So in this case, their optimal move, when the minimum wage is increased to $9 an hour, is to hire 90 people, right? Move us to the economically efficient level of employment. So when you have market power, for relatively small minimum wage increases, you can actually increase employment and increase wages and increase economic efficiency by imposing a minimum wage. Now, we can't do this for any minimum wage, right? If we set a minimum wage at $12 an hour, we would still end up with job losses, right? Because at $12 an hour, we would only have 30 people whose marginal revenue product is higher than 12, right? We would still have job losses. But if we set a minimum wage anywhere between, right, the marginal revenue product at the firm's profit maximizing level of labor and the firm's minimum wage, the firm's optimal wage, we are going to in fact see increases in employment, right? Either set by the labor supply curve or set by the marginal revenue product curve, whichever one is lower. Now, this isn't magic, right? This isn't rocket science. Essentially, all that's happening here is just like before. When we set a minimum wage, we have more labor being supplied, and we have less labor being demanded, right? The only difference is now, because of the fact that the wage was set artificially low by the firm with market power, labor demand was never the limiting factor, right? It was never the issue. So for modest minimum wage increases, we can have employment go up because more labor is supplied, even as the firm's ideal number of workers decreases. And likewise, right, if our goal is to increase economic efficiency, a wage subsidy is actually going to increase rather than decrease efficiency. So just like in the competitive market case, right, if we paid $3 an hour to the firm for each worker they hired, their demand would shift up by $3, right? Because now they're paying $3 less. You could also think of it as each worker now bringing in $3 more revenue than they did before. So, the point where marginal expense of labor intersects with our marginal revenue product curve is now going to be at a higher employment level and a higher wage, right, than we had before, and our deadweight loss is going to shrink. However, because of the fact that our marginal expense of labor is steeper than our labor supply curve, the firm is going to end up taking a larger fraction of the subsidy when the firm has market power than they would if they lacked market power. So subsidies are going to increase economic efficiency in a monopsonistic situation because of the fact, right, that our problem is too little employment, right? Our economic efficiency problem is too low employment, and a subsidy is going to increase equilibrium levels of employment. but it's not going to be as efficient of a way of doing so as is a minimum wage because of the fact that a large share of that subsidy is going to go to the monopsonistic employer rather than going to the workers themselves. Okay, so one last thing I'm going to throw at you, and then I'll get out of your face for today. I really appreciate you sticking with me, by the way, is what would happen if we've got employers and workers, both of whom have market power. So one way this might happen, of course, is if one particular worker is a unique and special individual, right, who has skills that can't be replicated by anyone else, right, so that the employer has a downward sloping demand curve for them. But another way that this could happen is that you have an employer with market power being met by a unionized workforce, right? So a group of employees that decide to collectively bargain so that the employer's demand for their shared labor is going to have a downward sloping supply. So in this case, right, we've got a marginal revenue product that's downward sloping. We're going to have an inverse labor supply curve that's upward sloping. If we think from the firm's perspective, we say, what would the firm like the wage to be? The firm would like to have, as we said before, right, marginal expense of labor equal their marginal revenue product. So the firm's ideal would be a wage right here, right, W star, or I'll say WF for firm. On the other hand, right, if we think about the union, right, the workers that have this upward sloping supply of labor, they're facing a downward sloping demand curve, right? So just like if they were a monopoly supplier of anything else, their ideal, right, their surplus maximizing level of employment and wage will be where the marginal revenue is equal to their marginal cost of labor, right, which is equal to their inverse supply curve, right, because again, right, what this W represents is the value to them of their leisure time. So their ideal would be what I'll call WU. Now, what's actually going to happen is going to depend on the strength of the union relative to the strength of the firm, right, which one has the most negotiating ability. If they're purely negotiating over wage, right, then they could end up with a wage anywhere between WU and WF, depending on their ability to negotiate. However, right, the closer they get to this profit maximizing or surplus maximizing wage, W star, right, the closer the negotiations get to there, the more total surplus there's going to be to divide between workers and firms. So what you might expect to see is that workers and firms will agree to a wage close to W star, and then negotiate on other things, right? So for example, if W star is below the wage that unions could get if they negotiated purely on wage, unions might negotiate for a really good healthcare plan, right? That's going to be common to all workers, and therefore isn't going to lead employers to ask for fewer hours of work. Right, on the other hand, if W star is higher, right, than the wage the firm could get from negotiating, then the firm might ask for things from the union, right? They might offload training responsibilities, for example, onto the union and away from themselves. Okay. So what are the big takeaways here? Well, one of the most important takeaways is when you have one individual actor with market power, right? Let's say the firm with market power, we might make an economy more efficient rather than less efficient by having another actor who also has market power. In other words, if we eliminated unions without eliminating firm market power, we might actually result in, again, as a result of that, lower levels of employment, lower wages, and less economic efficiency. So this is an important caveat, right, to our understanding of the welfare theorems, is that even though efficient markets, or perfectly competitive markets are going to be efficient, that doesn't necessarily mean that any move closer to perfect competition is always going to result in higher levels of efficiency. Now, one last thing I'll say before I walk away from this is that empirically, the share of the surplus between employers and employees that goes towards employees has been estimated as about 5% going to workers. So in real life, workers have very, very little market power relative to employers. And that's been a trend that's increased pretty dramatically over the last 40 years. Okay, thank you so much for sticking with me. I look forward to talking to you about this soon. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.